The needle slipped, and a bead of blood welled on Lila Jameson's thumb before she could stop it, falling onto the white silk in her lap like a garnet against snow. She cursed, blotting quickly with a scrap of muslin, but the stain had already set into the bodice panel. The lights had gone out 3 hours ago, block by block across the city, and now she worked by the last of the candle stubs she'd scavenged from the supply closet, her eyes burning in the flickering amber glow. Outside the shuttered windows of Marchand Bridal, the streets of Lower Manhattan lay dark and silent. The blackout had started at sunset, precise as clockwork, and everyone who understood what it meant had already locked themselves indoors. The rest would learn. Lila bent closer to her work, threading the needle again with hands that trembled only slightly. 6 years she had worked in this atelier, stitching gowns for women who glided through the front door in furs and diamonds, women whose biggest concern was whether the Alençon lace would arrive from France in time. 6 years of basting hems and setting sleeves and embroidering seed pearls onto silk that cost more per yard than she made in a month. 6 years of watching other women marry while her sister rotted in the ledgers beneath the city. The gown spread across her lap was not meant for a wedding. Not yet. First, it was meant to be a key. She had found the pattern in her grandmother's sewing box 2 months ago, tucked inside a crumbling envelope alongside a daguerreotype of a woman in mourning dress. The lace pattern was like nothing Lila had ever seen, intricate as frost on glass, each motif interlocking with the next in a design that seemed to shift when she looked at it too long. On the back of the photograph, in faded ink, for when you need to speak to those who do not wish to listen. Her grandmother had been dead for 15 years, but the women in Lila's family kept their secrets sewn into hems and hidden in pattern books, passed down like recipes. This pattern was old. Older than her grandmother, older than the city itself, perhaps. And if the blood laws were true, if the stories whispered in the workrooms and laundries were more than superstition, then a human who appeared before the throne of knights in a garment made entirely by her own hands could not be refused audience, could not be turned away unheard. The bodice was nearly finished, the skirt panels already joined and pressed. She had worked in stolen hours, in the dead spaces between midnight and dawn, using fabric she'd bought with every penny of her savings, and some she'd borrowed against wages she hadn't earned yet. The design was simple by bridal standards, no train, no veil, just a fitted bodice and a full skirt that would let her walk and kneel, but every stitch was hers. Every seam, every dart, every inch of the mourning lace she had painstakingly reproduced from that century-old fragment. Her sister's face rose in her mind as it did a dozen times a day. Emma, 22 years old, with their mother's dark curls and their father's stubborn chin. Emma, who had signed an indenture contract to pay for Lila's trade school tuition, who had smiled and said it was only for 5 years, and they'd pay well, and she'd be fine. That had been 7 years ago. Lila's hand stilled on the silk. The midnight court kept its contracts. Everyone knew that. But no one had told them that the court's years were not mortal years, that time moved differently in the halls beneath the city, that 5 years in the ledger might mean a decade or more above ground. No one had told them that humans who went into indenture came back changed. If they came back at all pale and silent, their eyes too bright, their smiles too knowing. If they came back. The candle beside her guttered, wax pooling around the stub. Lila had perhaps another hour of light. She picked up the needle again and began to work, her stitches small and even, the rhythm of it calming the panic that always lurked at the edges of her mind. In through the silk, out again, pulling the thread taut, but not too tight. Each stitch a small act of hope, each seam a prayer to gods she wasn't sure she believed in. The pattern seemed to glow in the candlelight, the lacework catching the flame and throwing it back in strange shadows. Lila had memorized every line of it by now, could have stitched it blind. She had woven it into the cuffs and the neckline, had scattered it across the bodice like snowfall, had hemmed the skirt with it in a border that ran unbroken around the entire circumference. 300 hours of work, maybe more. Her eyes ached, her fingers were cramped into claws, and she had lost weight she couldn't afford to lose. But the gown was nearly done. By dawn, it would be finished. By tomorrow night, She would descend into the court beneath the city and demand her sister's freedom. The thought should have terrified her. It did terrify her. But terror was just another kind of fuel, and Lila had been burning on fumes for 7 years. She worked through the last of the candle, and when the flame finally died, she worked by the gray pre-dawn light that seeped through the shutters, her vision blurring until the stitches became a meditation, a mantra, a spell. The final seam closed just as the sun broke over the East River, light flooding the workroom and turning the white silk incandescent. Lila tied off the thread, bit it clean, and held up the gown. It was the most beautiful thing she had ever made. She slept for 3 hours on the cutting table, the gown draped carefully over a dress form beside her, and woke to the sound of her phone buzzing with messages. The power had come back on. The city was moving again, trucks rumbling past, voices calling on the street below. Lila sat up, her back screaming in protest, and checked the time. 4 in the afternoon. She had 12 hours before the gates opened. She ate a protein bar from her bag, drank water from the tap in the bathroom, and spent the next hour washing and braiding her hair, cleaning the blood from under her fingernails, making herself as presentable as she could. The gown required no pressing. The silk had a faint luster that seemed to come from within, and the lacework lay flat and perfect against the fabric. At 6, she locked the atelier behind her and carried the gown home in a garment bag, riding the subway north with the dress form balanced awkwardly beside her. People stared, but New Yorkers had seen stranger things. A woman with tired eyes in a wedding gown was barely worth a second glance. Her apartment was a 5th-floor walk-up in Inwood, one room with a kitchenette and a bathroom the size of a closet. She hung the gown on the back of the door and stared at it while she ate leftover rice and tried not to think about what came next. The entrance to the midnight court was not a secret exactly. It was simply that most people chose not to see it. The old City Hall subway station, abandoned since 1945, beautiful and forgotten beneath the streets. The living city flowed over it and around it, and at night other things flowed through. Lila had been there once before, 7 years ago, holding Emma's hand while a vampire in a charcoal suit explained the terms of the contract. Standard indenture, he had said, 5 years of service in exchange for $20,000, paid in advance. Humans were needed for daylight errands, for work in the sun-facing offices, for a dozen small tasks that the court could not manage on its own. Emma would be housed and fed and kept safe. The contract was ironclad, enforceable in both mortal and immortal law. He had not mentioned that 5 years might stretch into forever. Lila showered, dried her hair, and dressed slowly, as if for battle. Undergarments first, plain and practical. Then the gown, the silk sliding over her skin like cool water. She had made it to fit herself exactly, and it did the bodice snug across her ribs, the skirt falling in clean lines to the floor. She had no shoes fine enough, so she wore the only heels she owned, black pumps with scuffed toes that wouldn't show beneath the hem. No jewelry, no makeup. Just herself and the gown and the pattern her grandmother had left her. At 11:30, she locked her apartment and descended into the subway. The trains were still running, the platform crowded with late-night travelers. Lila rode the 6 train south to Brooklyn Bridge, then transferred to the loop that would take her past the old City Hall station. The other passengers thinned out until she was alone in the car, the lights flickering as the train slowed. She stepped off at the gap between stations, into the darkness. For a moment, she stood on the empty platform, her heart hammering. Then she saw the stairs, winding down into shadows that no mortal lamp could touch. She lifted her skirt and descended. The air grew colder with each step, and the sounds of the city faded until all she could hear was her own breathing and the whisper of silk against stone. The stairs ended at a corridor lined with tiles, green and cream, the old mosaic still bright despite the decades of disuse. At the end of the corridor, a door stood open, and beyond it, light. Lila stepped through. The midnight court was not what she had expected. She had imagined something out of a Gothic novel, all shadows and cobwebs and crumbling grandeur. Instead, she found herself in a space that looked like the lobby of a very expensive, very old hotel. Marble floors, velvet drapes, brass fixtures polished to a mirror shine. A chandelier hung from the vaulted ceiling, dripping with crystals that scattered light in 1,000 directions. And vampires, dozens of them, moving through the space with the fluid grace of predators, their skin pale as porcelain, their hair ranging from silver to white blonde to the colorless clarity of ice. They wore modern clothes suits and dresses that would not have looked out of place in a Fifth Avenue office, but there was something ancient in their eyes, something that made Lila's instincts scream at her to run. She forced herself to stand still, her hands folded in front of her, and waited. A woman approached, tall and regal in a navy dress, her hair pulled back in a sleek chignon. Her eyes were the color of winter storms, and when she spoke, her voice was cultured and cold. "You are either very brave or very foolish, mortal. The court is not open to petitioners tonight." Lila's mouth was dry, but she managed to keep her voice steady. "I come under the blood laws. I wear a garment made entirely by my own hands, and I claim the right of audience." The woman's gaze traveled over the gown, and something flickered in her expression, surprise, perhaps, or recognition. "That is an old law, very old. Few remember it. But it still stands." A pause. Then, slowly, the woman inclined her head. "It does. Wait here." She turned and glided away, disappearing through a doorway hung with crimson curtains. Lila waited, her pulse loud in her ears. Around her, the other vampires had stopped what they were doing and were watching her with expressions that ranged from curiosity to amusement to something darker. She did not let herself look away. The woman returned a few minutes later, her face unreadable. "The king will see you. Follow me." Lila's knees nearly buckled with relief, but she forced herself to walk steadily, her chin up, her spine straight. The woman led her through a series of corridors, each more opulent than the last, until they reached a set of double doors carved with symbols Lila did not recognize. The doors swung open, and Lila stepped into the throne room. It was a cathedral of shadows and light, the ceiling lost in darkness above, the walls lined with columns that looked like they had been carved from a single piece of obsidian. At the far end of the room, on a dais of black marble, sat the throne of knights. And on the throne sat the king. He was younger than she had expected, or at least he looked younger, perhaps 30, though she knew appearances meant nothing among his kind. His hair was white blonde, falling to his shoulders in a straight, heavy curtain, and his skin was so pale it seemed to glow in the candlelight. He wore black, simple and severe, and his eyes were the color of old gold, bright and sharp and utterly inhuman. He was the most beautiful and the most terrifying thing Lila had ever seen. She stopped at the base of the dais, her hands trembling, and waited. For a long moment, the king said nothing. He simply looked at her, his gaze traveling from her face to the gown and back again. Then he leaned forward slightly, his eyes narrowing, and Lila saw something shift in his expression. Surprise, shock. He rose from the throne in a single fluid motion and descended the dais, his steps silent on the marble. Lila's instinct screamed at her to back away, but she held her ground, even when he stopped less than an arm's length from her. He reached out, his fingers hovering just above the lacework on her bodice, not quite touching. "Where did you get this pattern?" His voice was soft, almost gentle, but there was an edge to it that made Lila's throat tighten. She swallowed. "It was my grandmother's. I found it in her sewing box." "Your grandmother." He said it slowly, as if tasting the words. "What was her name?" "Marjorie Cather. She died 15 years ago." The king's eyes were locked on the lace, his expression unreadable. "This is the mourning weave of the House of Winter. My house, a pattern that has not been seen in 200 years because there is no one left alive who remembers it." Lila's heart stuttered. "I didn't know, you reproduced it perfectly." He looked up at her then, and the intensity in his gaze made her breath catch. "Every line, every motif. How?" "I'm a seamstress. I've been sewing since I was 6. The pattern was in a photograph, and I copied it." "By hand?" "Yes." He stepped back, his eyes still fixed on her, and then, to Lila's utter astonishment, he sank to one knee. The throne room went silent. Lila heard a sharp intake of breath from somewhere behind her, and then a ripple of whispers, but the king did not look away from her. "Under the blood laws," he said, his voice carrying through the chamber, "a human who comes before this throne in a garment made entirely by her own hands cannot be refused audience. The law is ancient and it is absolute. I kneel to the law, to the garment, and to the woman who wears it. Speak your petition." Lila's mind was spinning, but she forced herself to focus. This was why she had come. This was what mattered. "My sister, Emma Jameson, is in your indenture ledger. She signed a contract 7 years ago for 5 years of service. I ask that her contract be declared fulfilled and that she be released." The king rose to his feet, his expression thoughtful. 7 mortal years is well past the term of a standard indenture. Why has she not been released? A voice spoke from the shadows near the throne, dry and precise. "Because, Your Majesty, the contract specifies 5 years of service, not 5 mortal years. Time moves differently here, as you well know. By the court's reckoning, she has served 4 years and 3 months. A man stepped into the light vampire, not human, with silver hair and a face like carved marble. He wore robes of deep purple, and his eyes were cold and calculating. Lila recognized him. Chancellor Isidore, the one who had explained the contract to Emma all those years ago. The king's gaze flicked to him, and Lila saw a flash of something dangerous in those golden eyes. "An interesting interpretation, Chancellor. Tell me, when did we begin using such fine distinctions in our contracts?" "The law is clear, Your Majesty. The contract. I am not interested in your interpretation of the contract. I am interested in the spirit of the agreement." The king turned back to Lila. "Your sister believed she was signing for 5 mortal years?" Lila nodded. "Yes, that's what she was told." "Then 5 mortal years is what the contract should have stipulated." He looked at the chancellor. "Bring me the ledger." Isidore's jaw tightened, but he bowed and retreated into the shadows. The king turned back to Lila, his gaze softer now, almost curious. "What is your name?" Lila Jameson. "I am Wolfram Jarnheimer, king of this court and the last of the House of Winter." He gestured to the gown. "You have brought my family's mourning lace back from the grave, Lila Jameson. That alone would be worth a boon. But the law you invoked is older and stronger than any boon I might grant. If your sister's contract was made in bad faith, it will be voided." Relief flooded through her, so intense it left her dizzy. "Thank you. Do not thank me yet. The Chancellor is clever and he profits from the indenture system. He will not let this go unchallenged." As if on cue, Isidore returned, carrying a massive leather-bound ledger. He placed it on a stand near the throne and opened it, his fingers flicking through pages covered in dense script. "The contract of Emma Jameson, dated 7 years ago. The terms are clear. 5 years of service in exchange for $20,000, paid in advance. There is no specification of mortal years versus court years." Wolfram leaned over the ledger, his eyes scanning the text. Lila could see the tension in his shoulders, the way his hands curled into fists at his sides. "The contract does not specify court years either." "It does not need to, Your Majesty. All contracts made within this court are governed by court time unless otherwise stated. It is tradition. Tradition is not law. In this court, tradition is the foundation of law." Wolfram straightened, his expression glacial. "You are arguing that we may deceive humans into signing contracts they do not understand, and then hold them to terms they never agreed to?" Isidore's smile was thin. "I am arguing that the law is the law, Your Majesty. If we begin making exceptions for every human who claims they did not understand the terms, the indenture system will collapse." "Perhaps it should." The words fell into the room like stones into still water, and Lila saw several of the courtiers exchange startled glances. Isidore's face went carefully blank. "Your Majesty, the indenture system has served this court for centuries. It provides us with daylight labor, with connections to the mortal world, with with a convenient source of cheap labor that we can exploit because humans do not understand how time moves in this realm. Wolfram's voice was cold, controlled, but Lila could hear the anger beneath it. I have tolerated this system because I inherited it, but I will not tolerate deception. If Emma Jameson was told she would serve for 5 mortal years, then 5 mortal years is the term of her contract, and she will be released immediately. Isidore bowed, but his eyes were hard. As you wish, Your Majesty. However, there is the matter of the petition itself. What matter? The blood law states that a human who appears before the throne in a garment made entirely by her own hands cannot be refused audience. It does not state that their petition must be granted. The law guarantees only that they will be heard. Wolfram went very still. Are you suggesting that I have heard her, and I may now disregard her request? I am suggesting, Your Majesty, that the law is precise in its wording. You have given her audience. You have heard her petition. Whether you choose to act on it is entirely at your discretion. Lila's stomach dropped. She looked at Wolfram, saw the fury in his eyes, and realized with a sinking certainty that Isidore was right. The law guaranteed her a hearing, nothing more. Your Majesty. She spoke before she could stop herself, and every vampire in the room turned to look at her. She forced herself to meet Wolfram's gaze. If the contract is in dispute, there must be a way to settle it. What would you need to void the contract? Isidore answered before Wolfram could speak. Proof that the terms were misrepresented. Proof that your sister was deceived. But such proof would be difficult to obtain, as the only witnesses to the signing were myself and your sister, and she is in no position to testify. Why not? Because she is indentured, and her testimony would be considered biased. Lila's hands clenched in the silk of her skirt. That's insane. That is the law. She looked at Wolfram, desperate. There must be something, some precedent, there is one possibility. Wolfram's voice was quiet, but it cut through the room like a blade. He turned to Isidore. The mourning lace she wears, if it can be proven that it is authentic, that it is indeed the pattern of the House of Winter, then it could be entered into evidence. Isidore frowned. Evidence of what, Your Majesty? Evidence of provenance. If her grandmother possessed knowledge of a pattern that has been lost for 2 centuries, it suggests a connection to my house. And if there is such a connection, it raises questions about how the Jameson family came to be entangled with this court. That is a very tenuous connection, Your Majesty. Perhaps, but the blood laws are not solely about what is stated. They are about what is invoked. She has worn the mourning lace of my house into this court, and I have knelt to it. That creates a bond, whether you like it or not. Isidore's expression tightened. You are saying that because she wears a pattern associated with your house, she has some claim on your protection? I am saying that the law she invoked is older than your contracts, and it carries weight that you cannot simply dismiss. If she can prove that the gown was made entirely by her own hands, and if the pattern is authentic, then her petition has merit beyond the simple matter of contract interpretation. Prove it how, Your Majesty? She has already stated that she made the gown herself. Her statement is not enough. The law requires evidence. Lila's mind raced. Evidence. How could she prove that she had made the gown? She had worked alone, in the atelier after hours, with no witnesses. There were no photographs, no videos, nothing but the gown itself and her own exhausted hands. And then it came to her. I can prove it, she said. All eyes turned to her. The pattern. I didn't just copy it, I adapted it. There are places where I had to improvise because the photograph was damaged, places where I made my own choices about how to complete the design. If someone who knew the original pattern looked closely, they would see the differences. Wolfram's gaze sharpened. You are saying that your version is not identical to the original. It's as close as I could make it, but no, it's not identical. I'm a seamstress, not a forger. I made the best interpretation I could from a 200-year-old photograph. And you believe these differences would prove that you made the gown yourself, rather than commissioning it or purchasing it? Yes, because anyone who knew the original pattern would know where I deviated from it. And those deviations would show the work of a human hand, not a machine or a professional forger. Isidore's expression was skeptical. That is hardly conclusive proof, Your Majesty. It is more proof than you have offered to the contrary. Wolfram turned to the assembled court. Is there anyone present who remembers the original mourning lace of the House of Winter? Silence. Then, from the back of the room, a woman stepped forward. She was ancient even by vampire standards, her hair white as frost, her skin translucent as paper. She moved slowly, leaning on a cane, but her eyes were sharp and clear. I remember it, she said, her voice thin but steady. I was a child when the House of Winter fell. I saw the mourning lace at the funeral of the last queen. Wolfram's expression softened slightly. Lady Seraphine, I did not know you were in attendance tonight. I am always in attendance, Your Majesty. I simply do not often speak. She approached Lila, her gaze fixed on the gown. May I? Lila nodded, her heart in her throat. Seraphine reached out with one gnarled hand and touched the lace at Lila's cuff, her fingers tracing the pattern with a delicacy that belied her age. She was silent for a long moment, her eyes distant, as if looking into the past. Then she looked up at Wolfram. It is the mourning lace, Your Majesty, but it is not quite right. Here and here. She pointed to 2 places on the bodice. The motifs are reversed, and here the border is wider than it should be. Small differences, but they are there. Differences that would be consistent with someone copying from an incomplete source? Yes, Your Majesty. Or with someone improvising because they did not know the full pattern. Wolfram looked at Lila. You said you worked from a photograph. Was it damaged? Lila nodded. The edges were torn and some of the detail was blurred. I did my best, but I had to guess in places. Seraphine nodded slowly. That would explain it. The pattern is correct in spirit, but not in every particular. It is the work of a skilled hand, but a mortal hand. No vampire would have made those mistakes. Isidore stepped forward, his voice sharp. With respect, Lady Seraphine, that does not prove she made the gown herself. It only proves that the gown was made by a mortal. True. Seraphine turned to Lila, her gaze searching. Child, show me your hands. Lila held out her hands, palms up. They were a seamstress's hands, the fingers calloused and scarred from years of needle pricks, the nails cut short and uneven. On her right thumb, the fresh wound from the night before was still visible, a small red line where the needle had slipped. Seraphine took one of Lila's hands in both of hers, turning it over, examining the calluses and scars. Then she looked at the gown, at the tiny even stitches that covered every seam, and back at Lila's hands. These hands made this gown, she said quietly. I have seen enough work in my long life to know the mark of a maker. The gown carries her blood and her sweat and her hope. It is hers. Wolfram's gaze was intent. You are certain? As certain as I can be without having watched her sew every stitch. Isidore opened his mouth to protest, but Wolfram cut him off with a gesture. That is sufficient. Lila Jameson has proven authorship. The gown is authentic, and the pattern invokes the mourning lace of my house. Her petition is therefore entered into law as evidence, and I rule that the contract of Emma Jameson was made in bad faith. It is void, and she is to be released immediately. The words rang out through the throne room, final and absolute. Lila felt her knees go weak, and she had to lock them to keep from swaying. Isidore's face was a mask of controlled fury. Your Majesty, this sets a dangerous precedent. If every indentured human can simply what, Chancellor? Sew a gown by hand, invoke a law that none of them know exists, and stand before me without trembling? If they can do that, then perhaps they deserve to be heard. Wolfram's voice was cold. And if our contracts are so poorly written that they can be exploited through deliberate deception, then perhaps we need to rewrite them. Your Majesty. This discussion is over. Release Emma Jameson, now. Isidore bowed stiffly and turned to leave, but Wolfram's voice stopped him. And Chancellor, I will be reviewing the indenture ledger personally, every contract, every term, every clause. If I find any more examples of humans being deceived into longer service than they agreed to, there will be consequences. Isidore's jaw tightened, but he bowed again and left without another word. Wolfram turned back to Lila, and the coldness in his expression melted away, replaced by something warmer. You have your sister's freedom. The contract will be struck from the ledger within the hour, and she will be returned to you before dawn. Lila's throat was tight with tears she refused to shed. Thank you. Do not thank me. You won this yourself. I merely enforced the law. He paused, his gaze searching her face. Tell me, Lila Jameson, why did you not simply hire a lawyer? Why go to such lengths to sew a gown and invoke an ancient law? Because I tried the lawyers, Lila said quietly. I tried for 7 years. They all said the same thing: the court's contracts are ironclad. There's nothing to be done. Your sister knew what she was signing. I ran out of options. This was the only thing left. Wolfram's expression was unreadable. And if the law had not worked, if I had refused to hear you, then I would have found another way. I'm not leaving this city without my sister. Something flickered in his eyes, respect, perhaps, or admiration. You are either very brave or very foolish, as Lady Marin said. I am not yet certain which. Does it matter? No, I suppose it does not. He gestured to one of the attendants. Take Miss Jameson to the waiting room and bring her refreshment. I will send for her when her sister is ready. Lila was led out of the throne room and into a smaller chamber furnished with velvet sofas and low tables. A vampire in servant's livery brought her tea and small cakes that she was too nervous to eat. She sat on the edge of a sofa, her hands folded in her lap, and waited. The minutes stretched. An hour passed, then 2. Lila's nerves frayed with every tick of the clock on the mantel. What if Isidore had refused to release Emma? What if the king's word was not enough? What if the door opened and Emma stumbled through? She looked older than Lila remembered, her face thinner, her eyes shadowed with exhaustion. But she was alive, and she was whole. And when she saw Lila, she let out a sob and threw herself forward. Lila caught her, and they clung to each other, both of them crying too hard to speak. Emma's hands clutched at the silk of the gown, and Lila felt the dampness of her sister's tears soaking into the fabric. I'm here, Lila whispered. I'm here, you're safe. You're coming home. I thought I'd never... Emma couldn't finish the sentence, her voice breaking. They stayed like that for a long time, holding each other, until the tears ran dry and the shaking stopped. Finally, Emma pulled back, her hands still gripping Lila's arms. How did you do this? They said my contract was voided, but they wouldn't tell me how. Lila looked down at the gown, at the lace that had saved them both. I made a dress, and I asked for help. Emma's gaze followed hers and her eyes widened. You made this? Every stitch. Lila. Emma's voice was full of wonder. It's beautiful. It's a key, Lila said. Or it was. Now it's just a dress. It's more than that. Emma touched the lace, her fingers trembling. It's proof that you'd do anything for me, even this. Lila's throat tightened again. Of course I would. You're my sister. The door opened again, and Wolfram stepped in. He had changed out of the severe black clothing and now wore a simpler tunic and trousers, though his presence was no less commanding. His gaze went to Emma, then to Lila. Your sister is free to go. I have had the contract struck from the ledger and marked as void. No one will come after her. Emma looked at him, her eyes wide, and then she curtsied clumsily. Thank you, Your Majesty. Wolfram inclined his head. You were wrong by this court. I am sorry it took so long to set it right. It's not your fault. Perhaps not. But I am responsible for what happens within these walls, and I have been too lenient with the Chancellor's schemes. That ends now. He turned to Lila. I have a proposition for you, if you are willing to hear it. Lila's stomach tightened. A proposition? The gown you made carries the mourning lace of my house. That pattern was lost 200 years ago, and with it, a part of my family's history. You have brought it back. I would like to commission you to create more pieces using the pattern, to rebuild what was lost. Lila blinked. You want me to make clothes for you? For the court, formal garments, ceremonial robes, whatever you think appropriate. You would be paid, of course, and well, and you would have the court's patronage, which would open doors in the mortal world that are currently closed to you. I don't understand. Why me? You could hire any designer, any atelier. Because you are the one who remembered, Wolfram said quietly. Because your grandmother kept the pattern safe, and you had the skill and the courage to use it. That means something. It means you are connected to my house in ways I do not yet fully understand, and I would like to explore that connection. Lila's mind was spinning. A commission from the vampire court. Patronage. It was more than she had ever dreamed of, more than she could have hoped for, even in her wildest fantasies. But it also meant staying connected to this world, to the vampires and their laws and their dangers. She looked at Emma, saw the exhaustion and the fear still lingering in her sister's eyes, and thought of what 7 years in this place had cost her. I need time to think about it, she said finally. I need to get my sister home and make sure she's all right, and then I need to figure out what I want. Wolfram nodded, as if he had expected this. Of course, take all the time you need. When you are ready, send word, and we will talk. He handed her a card, plain white with a single line of text embossed in silver. A phone number, nothing more. Lila tucked it into the bodice of the gown and took Emma's hand. Thank you, she said. For everything. You owe me no thanks, Lila Jameson. You claimed what was yours by right, and I simply upheld the law. If anything, I owe you thanks for reminding me that the law exists to serve justice, not convenience. He escorted them to the entrance himself, walking with them through the marble corridors and up the stairs to the old subway platform. At the top of the stairs, he paused. Be careful in the mortal world. There are those who will not be pleased by what happened tonight, and some of them have long memories. Lila's stomach clenched. Are we in danger? No more than usual. The court's protection extends to those who have been wronged by it, and I have made it clear that you and your sister are under my personal safeguard. But it would be wise to be cautious for a while. I will, thank you. He inclined his head, and then he was gone, vanishing back into the shadows as if he had never been there. Lila and Emma climbed the last few stairs and emerged onto the subway platform just as a train was pulling in. They rode it north in silence, Emma leaning against Lila's shoulder, her eyes already half closed with exhaustion. By the time they reached Lila's apartment, dawn was breaking over the city, the sky turning pale gold and pink. Lila helped Emma inside, settled her on the narrow bed, and pulled a blanket over her. Emma was asleep within seconds, her breathing deep and even. Lila stood by the window, still wearing the gown, and watched the sunrise. The silk shimmered in the light, and the lace seemed to glow with a faint inner radiance. She thought of Wolfram, of the way he had knelt before her, of the fierce intelligence in his golden eyes. She thought of the court, of its beauty and its danger, of the laws that governed it and the people who twisted them for profit. She thought of the card tucked into her bodice and the proposition it represented, and she wondered, for the first time, what it might be like to step into that world not as a petitioner, but as a creator, as someone with power of her own. The days that followed were a blur of sleep and food and slow recovery. Emma slept for nearly 2 days straight, waking only to eat and use the bathroom before collapsing back into bed. Lila stayed close, watching over her, afraid that if she looked away, Emma would vanish again. On the 3rd day, Emma woke up clear-headed and ravenous, and Lila made her scrambled eggs and toast while Emma sat at the tiny kitchen table and talked. She talked about the court, about the endless days of filing paperwork and running errands in the mortal world while the sun was up, always aware that when she returned to the court, only hours had passed. She talked about the other indentured humans, some of whom had been there for decades by mortal reckoning, their contracts renewed again and again because the court's years moved so slowly. She talked about the fear, the loneliness, the way time seemed to slip through her fingers until she could barely remember what the world outside looked like. And she talked about the relief she had felt when the guards came to her cell and told her she was free. I didn't believe them at first, she said, her hands wrapped around a mug of tea. I thought it was a trick or a test. But then they took me to the chancellor's office and he had the ledger open and I saw my name crossed out. And he looked so angry, like he wanted to kill someone, and I thought, this is real. I'm really getting out. Lila reached across the table and took her hand. You're never going back. I'll make sure of it. Emma's eyes filled with tears. You shouldn't have had to do this. You shouldn't have had to risk yourself for me. You signed that contract so I could go to trade school, so I could learn to sew. This is the least I could do. You made a dress and walked into the vampire court alone. That's not the least of anything. That's... Emma shook her head, her voice breaking. That's the bravest thing I've ever seen. Lila didn't feel brave. She felt exhausted and shaky and more than a little overwhelmed. But she squeezed Emma's hand and tried to smile. We're safe now. That's all that matters. A week passed, then 2. Emma slowly regained her strength, the shadows under her eyes fading, her appetite returning. She moved back into her own apartment, a studio in Queens that Lila had been paying the rent on for 7 years, using the money Emma had given her before she left, and started looking for work. Lila went back to the atelier, back to her daily routine of pinning hems and sewing on buttons and listening to the hum of the machines. But it felt different now. Smaller. As if she had stepped outside of herself and could see the shape of her life from a distance, could see how narrow it had become. She thought about Wolfram's proposition, about the court's patronage, and what it might mean. One night, alone in her apartment, she took out the card he had given her and stared at the phone number embossed in silver. Her phone sat on the table beside her, silent and waiting. She picked it up and dialed before she could change her mind. The phone rang once, twice. Then a voice answered, smooth and familiar. Lila Jameson. I was beginning to think you would not call. Her heart jumped. Wolfram? The same. I trust your sister as well? She is. Thank you. Good. And you? Have you decided whether to accept my proposition? Lila took a breath. I want to hear more about it. What exactly would you want me to make? That depends on what you are willing to create. The mourning lace of my house is not the only pattern that has been lost to time. There are ceremonial robes, formal gowns, even livery for the court attendants, all of it lost when my family fell. I would like to see it restored. And you think I can do that? I think you have already proven that you can. The question is whether you wish to. Lila closed her eyes, thinking. If I agreed, I would need to work during the day. I can't come into the court every night and still hold down my job. You would not need to. I can provide you with space in the mortal world, a studio where you could work undisturbed. And if you chose to leave your current employment, I would compensate you for the loss of income. That's a big step. It is, but I think you are ready for it. She didn't know if that was true, but she knew she couldn't go back to sewing hems for other people's weddings. Not now, not after what she had seen and done. I'll do it, she said, but I have conditions. Name them. First, I work alone. No assistants, no supervisors, no one looking over my shoulder. If you want my work, you get it my way. Agreed. Second, I retain creative control. You can tell me what you want, but I decide how to execute it. Also agreed. And third, I want a contract, a real one, in mortal language, with no tricks and no fine print. I won't be indentured and I won't be trapped. There was a pause, and then Wolfram laughed, a low, warm sound that made something flutter in Lila's chest. You are wise to be cautious. Very well. I will have a contract drawn up, and you may have your own lawyer review it before you sign. Is there anything else? No, that's it. Then we have an agreement. I will send you the details tomorrow. In the meantime, Lila Jameson, I look forward to working with you. Likewise. She hung up, her hands shaking, and sat staring at the phone for a long time. She had just agreed to work for the Vampire King. The thought should have terrified her. Instead, she felt a strange, fizzing excitement, like champagne bubbles in her veins. The studio Wolfram provided was in a converted loft in Tribeca, all exposed brick and tall windows that flooded the space with light. It came fully equipped with sewing machines, cutting tables, rolls of fabric in every color and texture imaginable, and a library of pattern books that took Lila's breath away. She stood in the center of the room, turning slowly, trying to take it all in. Do you approve? Wolfram's voice came from behind her, and she turned to find him standing in the doorway, dressed in a charcoal suit that looked like it had been tailored specifically for him. In the daylight, or what passed for daylight, through the tall windows he looked almost human, though his skin still had that faint, otherworldly glow. It's incredible, Lila said honestly. I've never seen anything like it. Good. I want you to have everything you need to work without limitation. He walked into the room, his gaze sweeping over the space with the air of someone inspecting a gift they had carefully chosen. The building is secure, and the lease is in your name. You may come and go as you please. In my name? Yes. I do not want you to feel beholden to me for the space. It is yours, for as long as you wish to use it. Lila's throat tightened. That's you didn't have to do that. I know, but I wanted to. He turned to face her fully, his golden eyes serious. I meant what I said, Lila. I want your work, but I want it freely given, not coerced. If at any point you decide this arrangement is not to your liking, you may end it. No penalties, no consequences. She searched his face, looking for any hint of deception, but found none. He seemed sincere, almost earnest, and it unsettled her in a way she couldn't quite name. Thank you, she said finally. I appreciate that. You are welcome. He hesitated, then reached into his jacket and pulled out a folder. The contract as promised. I have had it reviewed by 3 separate lawyers, all mortal, all reputable. If you wish to have your own counsel examine it, I will wait as long as necessary. Lila took the folder and opened it, scanning the first page. The language was clear and straightforward, no archaic phrasing, no hidden clauses. She would be paid a generous salary with bonuses for completed commissions. The term was for 1 year, renewable by mutual agreement. Either party could terminate with 30 days' notice. It was the most transparent contract she had ever seen. This is fair, she said, looking up at him. More than fair. Then you will sign? She pulled a pen from her bag and signed her name at the bottom of the last page, her hand steady. Wolfram signed beside her, his script elegant and precise, and then it was done. She had just entered into a contract with the Vampire King. Wolfram folded the contract and tucked it back into his jacket. There is one more thing I would like to show you if you have time. What is it? Something that may help with your work. Follow me. He led her out of the studio and down a narrow staircase to a lower level she hadn't known existed. At the bottom of the stairs was a door, heavy and reinforced, with a keypad lock. Wolfram entered a code, and the door swung open to reveal a climate-controlled vault. Inside, hanging on padded racks and stored in archival boxes, were garments, dozens of them, maybe hundreds. Lila stepped closer, her breath catching as she recognized the materials, silk and velvet and brocade, all in shades of white and silver and black. These are from my house, Wolfram said quietly. What little survived the fall. Most of it is damaged, but there are fragments that might be useful to you. Patterns, techniques, details that have been lost. Lila reached out to touch a sleeve, the fabric so fine it felt like water against her fingers. This is 200 years old? Older, in some cases. My family was old even by vampire standards. She looked at him, saw the sadness in his eyes, and felt a sudden, unexpected pang of sympathy. What happened to them? A coup. The details are complicated and not particularly pleasant. Suffice to say that I am the last of my line, and I have spent the past 2 centuries rebuilding what was destroyed. He gestured to the garments. This is part of that rebuilding. I want to see my family's work live again, even if only in echo. Lila's chest ached. She understood loss, understood the need to hold on to what remained. I'll do my best to honor it. I know you will. That is why I chose you. They stood in silence for a moment, surrounded by the ghosts of the past. Then Wolfram turned to leave, and Lila followed him back up the stairs and into the light. Over the next few months, Lila threw herself into the work. She studied the fragments in the vault, sketched designs, experimented with fabrics and techniques. She recreated the mourning lace in a dozen different variations, each one a little more refined than the last. She designed robes for the court officials, gowns for the high-ranking vampires, even livery for the servants, all of it based on the scraps and remnants Wolfram had saved. He visited the studio often, sometimes to review her progress, sometimes just to talk. He was easy to work with, surprisingly so. He had strong opinions about design and aesthetics, but he listened to her input and trusted her judgment. And he was curious about her life, her process, the way she thought. They fell into a rhythm, a partnership that felt natural and effortless. Lila found herself looking forward to his visits, to the sound of his voice and the way he looked at her work with genuine appreciation. She told herself it was professional, that she was simply enjoying the collaboration. But late at night, alone in the studio, she would catch herself thinking about the way his eyes crinkled when he smiled, or the way his hand had brushed hers when he handed her a cup of tea, and she would have to force herself to focus on the work. One evening, as she was finishing a particularly intricate piece of embroidery, Wolfram arrived with a bottle of wine and 2 glasses. "A celebration," he said, pouring them each a generous measure. "You have completed the first set of ceremonial robes, and they are exquisite. The court is very pleased." Lila accepted the glass, her cheeks warming at the praise. "Thank you. It was a challenge, but I think it came out well. More than well. You have brought my family's aesthetic into the modern age without losing its essence. That is no small feat." They toasted, and Lila took a sip of the wine. It was rich and complex, far better than anything she had ever tasted. "This is incredible. What is it?" "A vintage from the court's cellars, older than most countries." He settled into one of the chairs near the cutting table, his long legs stretched out in front of him. "Tell me, Lila, are you happy with this arrangement? Is it what you hoped it would be?" She considered the question. "It's better than I hoped. I love the work, and I love having the freedom to create without constraints. It's everything I wanted when I went to trade school. But, no buts, I'm happy." He studied her for a moment, his gaze intent. "You do not strike me as someone who is easily satisfied. What is it you want beyond this?" Lila set down her glass, her fingers tracing the rim. "I don't know. I spent so long focused on getting Emma back that I didn't think much about what would come after. And now that she's safe, I feel like I'm standing at a crossroads, and I don't know which path to take." "Perhaps you do not need to choose only one." "What do you mean?" "You are talented, Lila, extraordinarily so. You could have a career in the mortal world, designing for the wealthy and the famous. Or you could continue working for the court, creating pieces that will be worn for centuries. Or you could do both. The choice is yours." She looked at him, at the sincerity in his expression, and felt something shift in her chest. "Why do you care so much about what I want?" Wolfram was silent for a long moment. Then he leaned forward, his elbows on his knees, his gaze never leaving hers. "Because you remind me that there is more to life than duty and obligation. You create beauty because you love it, not because you must, and that is a rare and precious thing." Lila's breath caught. There was something in his voice, something raw and unguarded, that made her heart race. "Wolfram, I know this is complicated," he said quietly. "I am not mortal, and our worlds are very different. But I find myself drawn to you in ways I did not anticipate, and I wanted you to know that, even if nothing comes of it." Lila's hands were shaking. She set down her glass before she could drop it. "I'm drawn to you too. I have been for a while. I didn't think that I would feel the same, that it would be possible. You're a king, and You are not just anything, Lila Jameson. You are the woman who walked into my court wearing mourning lace and demanded justice. You are the woman who brought my family's legacy back from the dead. You are extraordinary, and I would be a fool not to see that." Lila felt tears prick her eyes, and she blinked them back. "I don't know what to say." "You do not need to say anything. I only wanted you to know." He stood, and for a moment, she thought he would leave. But instead, he crossed to where she sat and offered his hand. "Dance with me." She looked up at him, startled. "There's no music." "Then we will make our own." She took his hand and he pulled her to her feet, guiding her into the center of the studio. He placed one hand on her waist and she rested her hand on his shoulder, and they began to sway. slow and gentle, to a rhythm only they could hear. Lila had never been much of a dancer, but with Wolfram, it felt effortless. He led with confidence and grace, and she followed, her body fitting against his as if they had been made for this. They danced in silence, the only sound the whisper of fabric and the faint hum of the city beyond the windows. And as they moved, Lila felt something inside her settle, as if a question she hadn't known she was asking had finally been answered. When the dance ended, Wolfram did not let go. He looked down at her, his golden eyes warm and intent, and Lila's breath stuttered in her chest. "May I kiss you?" he asked, his voice low. She nodded, unable to speak. He bent his head, and his lips met hers, soft and careful, as if she were something precious. Lila's hands tightened on his shoulders, and she kissed him back, pouring all the things she couldn't say into the press of her mouth against his. When they finally pulled apart, they were both breathing hard, and Wolfram's forehead rested against hers. "I have wanted to do that for weeks," he murmured. Lila laughed, breathless and dizzy. "So have I." They stayed like that for a long moment, wrapped in each other's arms, until Wolfram finally stepped back, his expression reluctant. "I should go. It is late, and you need rest. Will you come back tomorrow?" "If you wish me to." "I do." He smiled, a real smile that reached his eyes, and brushed a strand of hair from her face. "Then I will be here." He left, and Lila stood alone in the studio, her fingers pressed to her lips, her heart still racing. She was falling in love with the Vampire King. The thought should have terrified her, but instead, it felt like coming home. The weeks that followed were a kind of dream. Wolfram visited the studio every evening, and they would work together, talking and laughing and stealing kisses when the mood struck. He told her stories about the court, about the centuries he had lived, about the world as it had been before she was born, and she told him about her life, about her family, about the dreams she had set aside in the long years of trying to save Emma. They fit together in ways that surprised her. He was confident and commanding, yes, but he was also kind and curious and surprisingly playful. And he made her feel seen in a way she had never felt before, as if every part of her mattered. One evening, as they sat together on the floor of the studio, surrounded by bolts of fabric and half-finished sketches, Wolfram reached into his pocket and pulled out a small box. "I have something for you," he said, his voice unusually tentative. Lila's heart stuttered. "What is it?" He opened the box to reveal a ring, delicate and beautiful, set with a single diamond that glowed like captured moonlight. "It was my mother's, the only piece of her jewelry that survived the fall. I would like you to have it." Lila stared at the ring, her throat tight. "Wolfram, I can't, this is too much." "It is not too much. It is exactly right." He took the ring from the box and held it out to her. "I am not asking for forever, Lila. I know that our lives are complicated, and there are many things we must still navigate. But I am asking if you would consider building a life with me. A real life, not just stolen moments in a studio." Tears spilled down her cheeks, and she wiped them away with shaking hands. "You want me to be with you? Truly? I want nothing more. You have brought light into a life that has been dark for so long. I do not wish to let that go." Lila looked at the ring, at the way it gleamed in the lamplight, and thought of the gown she had sewn by candlelight, of the journey it had taken her on. She thought of Emma, safe and whole in her own apartment. She thought of the life she had built for herself, stitch by careful stitch. And she thought of Wolfram, who had knelt before her in a throne room, who had given her freedom and trust and partnership. "Yes," she said, her voice breaking. "Yes, I'll build a life with you." He slipped the ring onto her finger, and it fit perfectly, as if it had been made for her. Then he pulled her into his arms, and they held each other, both of them crying and laughing at the same time. "I love you," Lila whispered against his shoulder. "And I love you," Wolfram said, "more than I thought possible." They stayed like that for a long time, tangled together on the floor of the studio, surrounded by the work they had created together. And for the first time in as long as she could remember, Lila felt completely, utterly at peace. Planning a wedding when one half of the couple was a vampire king turned out to be more complicated than Lila had anticipated. There were protocols to follow, traditions to honor, and a seemingly endless list of courtiers who had opinions about everything from the guest list to the menu. But Lila had learned how to navigate the court's politics, and she was not about to let anyone dictate how she and Wolfram celebrated their union. "I'm making my own gown," she told him firmly, one evening in the studio. No arguments. Wolfram, who had been reviewing a list of potential ceremony venues, looked up with a grin. "I would not dream of arguing. I have seen what you can do with a needle and thread. I am quite looking forward to it." "Good, because I've already started sketching designs." She showed him the drawings, a gown that echoed the one she had worn to the court, but lighter, more joyful. The mourning lace would be there, woven into the bodice and sleeves, but this time it would be paired with layers of silk and tulle that caught the light and moved like water. Wolfram studied the sketches, his expression soft. "It will be beautiful, just like you." Flatterer. Truth-teller. He pulled her into his lap, his arms wrapping around her waist. "I cannot wait to see you in it." Lila leaned back against him, content. "Where do you want to have the ceremony?" "The court is pushing for the throne room, but I was thinking somewhere with more light." "What about here?" Wolfram gestured to the studio. "This is where we fell in love. It seems fitting." Lila's heart swelled. "I love that idea, but how would we make it work? There's not much space." "We do not need much space, just enough for us and a few witnesses. The rest can attend the reception afterward." And so it was decided. The ceremony would be held in the studio, with only their closest friends and family present. The reception would be at the court, a grand celebration that would satisfy the courtiers' need for spectacle. Lila threw herself into making the gown, working late into the night, just as she had before. But this time, there was no desperation, no fear, only joy and love, and the knowledge that she was creating something for herself, not as a petition, but as a promise. Emma visited often, marveling at the gown as it took shape. "You're really going to marry him?" she said one evening, her voice full of wonder. "I am." "Are you scared?" Lila considered the question. "A little, but mostly I'm excited. He makes me happy, Emma, happier than I've ever been." Emma hugged her, fierce and tight. "Then I'm happy for you. You deserve this. You deserve all of it." The night before the wedding, Lila worked alone in the studio, putting the final touches on the gown. The lace was complete, the seams were pressed, the hem was perfect. She hung it on the dress form and stepped back, admiring her work. It was the most beautiful thing she had ever created, even more so than the first gown. It was a testament to everything she had learned, everything she had become. And tomorrow she would wear it and marry the man she loved. The thought filled her with a giddy, breathless joy. She locked the studio and went home, but she barely slept, too excited to rest. By the time dawn broke, she was already awake, pacing her apartment and counting the hours. Emma arrived at noon to help her get ready, bringing coffee and pastries and a bottle of champagne. "For courage," she said with a grin. Lila laughed. "I don't need courage. I need to stop shaking. That's what the champagne is for." They spent the afternoon together, doing Lila's hair and makeup, talking and laughing like they used to before everything got complicated. And when it was finally time to put on the gown, Emma helped her into it, fastening the tiny buttons that ran down the back. Lila stood in front of the mirror, and her breath caught. The gown was perfect. The silk shimmered in the light, and the lace seemed to glow just as it had the first time. But this time, instead of mourning, it spoke of hope, of new beginnings. "You look like a queen," Emma whispered. Lila turned to her, tears in her eyes. "I feel like one." They arrived at the studio just as the sun was setting, the light pouring through the tall windows and turning everything golden. Wolfram was already there, dressed in black with a silver cravat, his white blonde hair pulled back in a low tail. When he saw Lila, he went very still, his eyes widening, and then, just as he had the first time, he knelt. "Wolfram," Lila said, her voice breaking, You don't have to. I knelt for the law the first time, he said quietly. This time, I kneel for you, for the woman you are, and the life we are about to build together. Lila's tears spilled over, and she crossed to him, taking his hands and pulling him to his feet. I love you, she whispered, and I love you. He cupped her face in his hands and kissed her, soft and reverent, and the small gathering of witnesses, Emma, Lady Seraphine, a handful of trusted courtiers, broke into applause. The ceremony was simple and beautiful. They exchanged vows they had written themselves, promising to love and honor each other, to build a life together that honored both their worlds. And when the officiant, a mortal judge who owed Wolfram a favor, pronounced them married, Wolfram kissed Lila again, and the studio erupted in cheers. The reception at the court was everything Lila had imagined and more. The throne room had been transformed into a ballroom, filled with flowers and candles and music. Vampires and mortals mingled, dancing and laughing, and for the first time in centuries, the court felt alive. Lila danced with Wolfram, with Emma, with Lady Seraphine, with courtiers she had never met. She ate food prepared by the court's chefs, drank wine from the cellars, and felt like she was floating. And when the night finally wound down, Wolfram took her hand and led her away from the crowd, to a private chamber that had been prepared for them. It was beautiful, all dark wood and soft candlelight, with a bed draped in silk and a view of the city through tall windows. "Are you happy?" Wolfram asked, pulling her into his arms. "Happier than I ever thought possible," Lila said, resting her head against his chest. They stood like that for a long moment, wrapped in each other, listening to the faint sounds of the celebration still going on below. "I have one more gift for you," Wolfram said finally. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small envelope, handing it to her. Lila opened it and found a deed inside, the title to the studio. "Wolfram, you already gave this to me. I gave you the lease. This is the building itself. It is yours, Lila, completely and irrevocably. No matter what happens, you will always have a place to create." Lila's throat was tight with tears. "Thank you. For this and for everything. You have given me far more than I could ever give you. You have given me hope and joy and a reason to believe in the future. That is a gift beyond measure." Lila kissed him, and they tumbled onto the bed together, laughing and tangled in silk and lace. And as the city glittered outside the window and the court celebrated below, Lila knew that she had found her place, not in the mortal world and not in the vampire court, but somewhere in between, where love and craft and courage could build a life that belonged to both. The months that followed were a whirlwind of change and growth. Lila's work for the court gained her a reputation in the mortal world, and soon she was receiving commissions from wealthy clients who wanted gowns that carried the same magic as the pieces she made for the vampires. She hired assistants, expanded the studio, and began teaching classes in traditional techniques that were in danger of being lost. Emma thrived, finding work as a paralegal and slowly rebuilding the life that had been stolen from her. She visited the studio often, sometimes to help with fittings, sometimes just to spend time with her sister. And Wolfram continued to rule the court, but with Lila by his side, his rule became more just, more compassionate. He overhauled the indenture system, ensuring that contracts were written in clear language and that humans understood exactly what they were agreeing to. He established a council of both mortals and vampires to advise him, giving voice to those who had previously been ignored. The court grumbled, but they could not argue with the results. Under Wolfram's leadership, the court became stronger, more stable, more respected by both the mortal and immortal worlds. And through it all, Lila and Wolfram built a life together. They divided their time between the court and the studio, between the mortal world and the immortal one. They traveled, they worked, they laughed, and they loved. One evening, a year after their wedding, Lila found herself standing in the studio, looking at a new project spread across her cutting table. It was a christening gown, small and delicate, made of the finest silk. Wolfram came up behind her, his arms wrapping around her waist, his chin resting on her shoulder. "A commission?" Lila turned in his arms, a smile playing at her lips. Not exactly. His eyes widened. Lila, are you— I'm pregnant. For a moment, Wolfram was utterly still. Then he let out a whoop of joy and lifted her off her feet, spinning her around until she was dizzy and laughing. A child, he said, his voice full of wonder. We are going to have a child. Are you happy? Happy does not begin to cover it. He set her down gently, his hands cradling her face. You have given me everything, Lila. A home, a purpose, a future, and now a family. I could not ask for more. Lila's eyes filled with tears. I love you, and I love you, always. 9 months later, Lila gave birth to a daughter. They named her Nadia after Wolfram's mother, and she had her father's golden eyes and her mother's dark hair. Lila had worried about how the pregnancy would go, given that Wolfram was a vampire and she was human. But the court's physicians, both mortal and immortal, had assured her that such unions were rare but not unheard of, and that with proper care, both mother and child would be fine. And they were. Nadia was healthy and strong, and from the moment she was born, she was loved beyond measure. Wolfram was a devoted father, doting on his daughter with a tenderness that surprised everyone, including himself. He would spend hours holding her, singing to her in languages long dead, telling her stories about the world and the stars and the long history of their family. And Lila watched them together, her heart so full it felt like it might burst. As Nadia grew, it became clear that she had inherited gifts from both her parents. She had her father's quick mind and her mother's creative spirit. And she had something else, too, a kind of magic that seemed to flow through her fingers when she touched fabric or thread. By the time she was 3, she was helping Lila in the studio, her tiny hands surprisingly deft as she learned to sew. She is going to be extraordinary, Wolfram said one evening, watching Nadia work with rapt attention on a scrap of silk. She already is, Lila said, her hand resting on her stomach, where another child was growing. Wolfram's gaze flicked to her, his eyes bright. Another? Another. He pulled her into his arms, and they stood together, watching their daughter create, knowing that they had built something beautiful and lasting. A family, a home, a future. Years passed, and the studio became a legacy, passed from mother to daughter. Nadia grew into a talented designer in her own right, and when her younger brother Valen was born, she doted on him just as her parents had doted on her. The court flourished under Wolfram's continued rule, and the partnership between the mortal and immortal worlds grew stronger. And at the center of it all was Lila, the seamstress who had walked into the vampire court wearing a gown she had made by candlelight, and who had changed everything. On their 10th wedding anniversary, Wolfram took Lila back to the studio where they had fallen in love. It had been expanded over the years, transformed into a full atelier, but the original space remained, preserved exactly as it had been. They stood together in the center of the room, holding hands, and Wolfram turned to her with a smile. Do you remember the night I asked you to dance? I remember every moment of that night. So do I. It was the night I realized I could not live without you. Lila's eyes filled with tears. I felt the same way. And do you still? Even after all these years and all the complications and all the chaos? Especially after all of that. You are my home, Wolfram. You and our children and the life we have built together. He kissed her, soft and slow, and when they pulled apart, they were both smiling. I have something for you, he said, reaching into his jacket. He pulled out a small velvet box and opened it to reveal a necklace, delicate and beautiful, with a pendant shaped like a piece of lace. I had it made from a fragment of the mourning lace, he said, the one you wore the night you came to the court, so you would always carry a piece of that moment with you. Lila's hands trembled as she took the necklace, running her fingers over the intricate metalwork. It's perfect, just like you. She fastened the necklace around her neck, and Wolfram pulled her close, his arms wrapping around her. Thank you, Lila whispered. Lila, for everything, for choosing me, for building this life with me, for giving me a family and a future I never dreamed was possible. Thank you, Wolfram said, his voice rough with emotion, for saving me from a life of duty without joy, for reminding me that there is beauty in the world and that it is worth fighting for being the bravest, most extraordinary woman I have ever known. They stood together in the studio, surrounded by the ghosts of the past and the promise of the future, and Lila knew that she had found her happy ending. Not in a fairy tale, but in the messy, complicated, beautiful reality of a life lived fully and loved deeply. And as the city hummed outside the windows and their children played in the rooms below, Lila and Wolfram held each other and knew that they had everything they needed. Each other, their family, and a love that would last for all the centuries to come.